regardless of our human plans, nature is always working. The Gorge Waterway is no exception, and it is here where a spineless, headless animal continues to build up the ecosystem it calls home. Olympia oysters are bivalve mollusks, soft-bodied animals that have built a home within two separate shells, or valves, that are connected by a hinge. The hinge acts like a door, allowing the oyster to open and close its shells with ease, while the shells themselves, like any reliable house, offer protection. Compared to introduced Pacific oysters, which are large in size and have chunky, uneven shells, Olympia oysters are small and flat, typically growing to a maximum of 6 to 9 centimeters long. Often rounder than long, they typically blend in well with the background. Olympia oysters are the only native oyster to British Columbia and were once abundant. Found mainly in estuaries, lagoons, tidal flats, and sheltered bays, these oysters thrived in waters as far south as Baja California and Mexico, and up north all the way to Alaska. Traditionally, many First Nations harvested these oysters and would boil, barbecue, or steam them to enjoy this delicious gift from the sea. In the late 1800s, an oyster craze consumed the coast, infatuated with the delicious taste of Olympia oysters. In the 1860s, a sack of Olympia oysters could sell for as much as $4 to $5. Today, that would be about $160 Canadian. By contrast, 10 pounds of cheese only cost $1.30. These oysters were harvested in such extraordinary numbers that some estimates indicate nearly 500,000 Olympia oysters were collected every year from Vancouver Island in the early 1900s. As a result, Olympia oyster populations were overexploited, harvesting stopped entirely, and their numbers never fully rebounded. In the gorge, however, an enigmatic stable population continues to thrive, providing information on the secrets of this oyster species' survival. When the waters warm, usually around May here in Victoria, Olympia oysters will begin their reproductive cycle. Male oysters will release hundreds of thousands of sperm into the surrounding current, while females begin producing eggs in their mantle cavity, an empty space under their shell that houses their gills. The sperm cannot swim against the swell of the sea, and therefore are reliant upon the current to reach the female oyster and ultimately her eggs. If sperm reaches and fertilizes her eggs, young Olympia oysters will hatch into larvae. The female oyster keeps her larvae in the mantle cavity of her shell for 2 weeks before the baby oysters are freed into the water. For up to another 2 to 3 weeks, the larvae will drift and glide, eat and grow amidst the tides before becoming spat, the stage where they settle on hard surfaces. Wherever the spat lands will become its permanent home. It is still a mystery what induces a larva to settle on a particular spot, but in the Gorge Waterway, some substrates are covered. Once attached, Olympia oysters cannot pursue their food, and instead must take whatever food comes their way. Oysters filter feed, meaning they strain microalgae and other planktonic food from the water. They gobble up pretty much anything they can get in their mouths, though they have some things they spit out. Nevertheless, their filtering helps maintain the water quality of the area they live in by keeping it clean to the benefit of all around them, including humans. As newly settled Olympia oysters grow and become numerous, they begin to form dense, layered oyster beds. These oyster beds, or reefs, provide ample living space not just for other Olympia oysters, but also for crabs, shrimps, sponges, tunicates, barnacles, and more, thus sustaining biodiversity and providing food for many animals. While native oyster beds no doubt once contributed to the ecosystems in many estuaries and bays, this habitat type has largely been lost in BC or replaced by non-native oyster beds. Now, Olympia oysters are most commonly found covering hard substrates, though also manage to survive in muddy habitats in smaller numbers. Olympia oysters are important in creating and preserving healthy marine ecosystems, but they need our help. Due to human causes such as historic overharvesting and pollution, as well as other environmental factors, many Olympia oyster populations have never rebounded. Despite the fact that they have not been harvested for consumption in quite some time, Olympia oysters were listed as a species of special concern by Canada's Species at Risk Act, called SARA for short, in 2003. This act aims to protect and conserve species at risk in Canada. The main goal of SARA for species listed as special concern is to prevent them from becoming threatened or endangered, which is accomplished through the implementation of a management plan. This plan outlines the conservation actions required to prevent further decline. For Olympia oysters, these actions are protection, management, research, monitoring and assessment, and outreach and communication. One management action is to mitigate the impact of development projects. A great example of this is the Craigflower Bridge replacement project in 2013. The bridge was home to an abundance of Olympia oysters that World Fisheries Trust collected and moved to artificial reefs elsewhere in the gorge. To compensate any habitat lost, the new bridge footings were textured and concrete reef balls were introduced to attract new oyster settlement. While there has been natural fluctuation of oyster abundance, our estimation after 5 years of surveys is that the impact of this project has been positive. In BC, Olympia oysters are currently facing threats from pollution, altered habitat, invasive species, disease, as well as the increasing impacts of climate change. Nevertheless, remnant populations persist, as in the Gorge Waterway. The strategy laid out in the Species Management Plan to date has been to monitor these populations, protect them from development, and limit harvest. In general, these populations have remained stable, though it is unknown how they will fare as effects of climate change become more pronounced. In the USA, recovery activities have been very different, with a variety of approaches to try to restore and expand Olympia oyster populations with new substrates and hatchery supplementation. A number of these projects have been quite successful. Many historic populations of Olympia oysters in BC have never returned. Canadian authorities are currently considering if these approaches would be beneficial or necessary here, while World Fisheries Trust is working with them to determine the feasibility of these approaches.